It begins, as many legends do, with a whisper, a name, drifting through time like the softest echo in an empty marble hall. Atlantis, the lost city, the drowned empire, the ancient utopia swallowed by the sea. You've heard it before, on dusty pages, on documentary voiceovers, on the hushed lips of dreamers. It's everywhere and nowhere. A place that might never have existed, and yet somehow never quite goes away. And what does it mean to chase such a place? Perhaps it means searching not only for sunken ruins, but for something else entirely. A missing part of our shared memory. A piece of ourselves we suspect was once greater, more connected, more advanced. The story of Atlantis is the story of that suspicion, carried like a torch through the ages. We owe the name to one man, Plato, philosopher, mystic, builder of allegories. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written in the 4th century BCE, he presents the tale not as fiction, but as a handed-down memory. A real account, he says, told to the Athenian statesman Solon by Egyptian priests, who in turn had read it from ancient inscriptions preserved in their temples. Atlantis, Plato claimed, was a naval power lying in front of the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The island was larger than Libya and Asia combined, filled with fertile plains, shimmering metal, and noble kings. But when the Atlanteans grew greedy and sought to conquer the known world, their arrogance offended the gods, and so, in a single night of earthquakes and floods, they were erased. Nothing remained. Not even a memory, it seems, until Plato picked up the thread. For centuries that was all we had. No one else in antiquity wrote about Atlantis, not Herodotus, not Aristotle, not Pliny. And yet the story endured. Historians are still debating whether Plato intended it as a historical account, a moral parable, or a warning dressed in myth. You might ask yourself, why has this legend endured for more than 2 millennia? Part of the answer lies in the nature of Atlantis itself. It is neither entirely real nor entirely unreal. It lives in the liminal spaces, in the grey fog between history and imagination. Like El Dorado or Shangri-La, it adapts. It moulds itself to each generation's hopes and fears, a perfect society lost, a punishment for hubris, a remnant of forgotten wisdom, or just a cautionary tale told to teach humility. And yet, there are moments, strange, glimmering moments, when something surfaces that makes us pause. Take Pavlopetri, for instance, an actual city more than 5,000 years old discovered off the coast of southern Greece. Its stone streets, buildings and courtyards lie perfectly preserved beneath just a few meters of water. Or the lost city of Heracleion, once the gateway to ancient Egypt, found in the early 2000s under the murky waters of the Mediterranean. Then there's Dwarka, in India, where submerged temple structures hint at an urban centre from the Bronze Age. The sea does not give up its dead easily, but sometimes when the sand shifts it whispers. There are civilizations that once stood proud on dry land, and now lie drowned beneath the waves. Earthquakes, sea level rise, tsunamis, forces far older than writing, erasing cities before they could be remembered. So perhaps the idea of a sunken city isn't so far-fetched. Perhaps Plato, in his own time, had heard rumours. Perhaps the Egyptians preserved stories of older floods, older kingdoms, remembered dimly through myth. Or perhaps Atlantis never existed at all, just a story, carefully constructed to serve a purpose. But if that's true, what purpose did it serve? In Plato's dialogues, Atlantis is not just a city, it is a foil, an anti-Athens, a symbol of what happens when a people abandon virtue for greed. Plato's Athens, by contrast, is brave, just, and moderate. He places his ideal city not in the future, but in the mythical past. Atlantis exists to be defeated, to fall, and in its fall, to teach a lesson. That alone should make us pause. Because Plato was not a historian. He was a philosopher with an agenda, a man interested in ideal forms, not factual reporting. He rarely told stories for their own sake, and yet, there are inconsistencies. Critias breaks off mid-sentence, unfinished. The tale of Atlantis ends without resolution. Was Plato planning to continue? Did he change his mind? Or was the incompleteness intentional, a kind of riddle? This uncertainty has given rise to centuries of speculation. In the 16th century, Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia, a work clearly influenced by Plato's idealized cities. Francis Bacon followed with the New Atlantis in 1627, envisioning a scientific paradise hidden in the Pacific. And then, in 1882, came Ignatius Donnelly, an American congressman with a flair for the dramatic. Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, arguing that all ancient civilizations, from Egypt to Mesoamerica, descended from Atlantis. He proposed that Atlantis was the biblical flood's true target, and that its survivors repopulated the earth, spreading knowledge and language like seeds across the continents. It was wildly speculative, and entirely lacking in evidence, but it struck a chord. Donnelly's book was a bestseller. It inspired occultists, theosophists, pseudoscientists, and alternative historians for generations. Even Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, would later claim that Atlantean records lay buried beneath the Sphinx. It's easy to scoff, but remember, Donnelly lived in a time when much of the earth was still unmapped, when new ruins and lost cities were being discovered every few years. Troy, after all, had been considered a myth until Heinrich Schliemann found it in the 1870s. Pompeii had only recently emerged from volcanic ash. Who was to say Atlantis wouldn't be next? Here's an odd fact to stir your sleepy thoughts. In the early 20th century, some respected, scientists seriously debated whether a lost continent might have existed in the Atlantic. They called it Atlantis, or the Mid-Atlantic Ridge Continent. Before the theory of plate tectonics was accepted, the idea that land masses could rise and sink wasn't considered entirely absurd. Today, we know better, mostly. We understand that continents don't just vanish overnight, but there are still ancient structures, submerged ruins, and puzzling anomalies that provoke questions, not answers, just gentle, persistent questions. And you, curled in your warm bed, may find yourself wondering, why does this myth pull at us so deeply? Is it the longing for a lost golden age? The romantic idea that we were once more advanced, more noble, more connected? Or is it the thrill of the chase, the idea that beneath the sand or sea something extraordinary might still be waiting? Before we drift further, take a moment to help this story reach others. Like the video, subscribe if the rhythm of this voice soothes your thoughts, and tell me, where in the world are you tonight? What time is it in your city, your village, your stretch of coastline? Do you live near the sea? Do you sometimes wonder what lies just beneath the tide? The dream of Atlantis isn't going anywhere. It surfaces in every generation. Each era retells it in its own voice, half believing, half hoping, never quite certain. But perhaps that's the point. Atlantis is the question we keep asking, the legend we cannot forget. A mirror held up to our civilization, showing us what we might become, or what we might lose. And now the trail begins. There are clues ahead, maps and measurements, ancient errors and misunderstood truths. Geography and geology will take the place of myth, but the story will never stop drifting. Because somewhere, between sleep and sea, the waves still carry a name that refuses to drown: Atlantis. So the trail begins, not with a map, but with a manuscript, a voice speaking through 24 centuries of ink and dust. The only source we have for the legend of Atlantis is Plato himself, and the clues he left us are as cryptic as they are compelling. You find yourself staring into the dialogue called Timaeus. It opens gently, with talk of gods and order, harmony and creation. Then, almost out of nowhere, it slips in the tale, a story told by Critias, who heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests in Sais. If that sounds like a game of telephone across generations and cultures, well, that's because it is. According to Plato, Solon had travelled to Egypt around 600 BCE, seeking knowledge from the temple archives. The priest told him of a mighty civilization that had existed 9,000 years before his time, long before the founding of Athens. This civilization had risen to power far to the west, beyond the Pillars of Heracles. It had conquered parts of Europe and Africa, but its aggression drew the wrath of the gods. A great cataclysm followed, and Atlantis was gone. That's the basic skeleton, but it's the details that drive the search. Plato tells us that the island was enormous, larger than Libya and Asia combined, that its central city was built in concentric rings, alternating water and land, that it had a great plain surrounded by mountains, teeming with elephants and rich in metals, including the mysterious orichalcum, that it was ruled by 10 kings descended from Poseidon, that it vanished in a single day and night of misfortune. All of this, supposedly, written down by priests who had preserved the memory for millennia. Now pause here, because this is where things get tricky. Even in Plato's time, critics were skeptical. Aristotle, his most famous student, is rumoured to have dismissed the story outright, saying, "He who invented it also destroyed it," a sharp line from a man who preferred logic over myth. But even that quote is disputed. Historians are still debating whether Aristotle ever said it, and so we're left with a tangle. Was Plato recounting a real tradition, or crafting a moral parable? Some scholars argue that Atlantis was entirely fictional, a symbolic foil for Athens, created to illustrate Plato's philosophy of ideal societies and their inevitable decline. Others suggest he may have drawn from fragments of older tales, memories of natural disasters, wars and lost peoples woven into a single narrative. And here's the real mystery. Plato never claimed to invent it. In Timaeus, he's very clear. "This tale," he writes, "is not a fiction, but a true account." He even chides the Greeks for having no memory of events before the flood, claiming their histories were like the minds of children, always forgetting, always starting over. So, should we believe him? Perhaps it depends on how we read Plato, not just the man, but the method. He often used myths and allegories to express complex truths. Think of the cave allegory, shadows and light, ignorance and enlightenment. It wasn't literal, but it was meaningful. Could Atlantis be another version of this technique? Still, there's something stubbornly literal in the way Plato describes Atlantis. He gives measurements, descriptions of terrain, a lineage of rulers, even a calendar system. If it's all made up, it's a remarkably detailed fabrication, and if it isn't, then where was it? Let's follow the geography. Plato says Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles. That would place it in the Atlantic Ocean, west of the Strait of Gibraltar. He says it had a vast plain, 3,000 stadia in length surrounded by mountains. The capital was a city made of rings, with canals, bridges, and a grand temple to Poseidon at its centre. For centuries, explorers searched for a matching landscape. Some looked to the Azores, others to the Caribbean, still others to the coast of Spain. In more recent decades, even Antarctica has had its moment in the speculative sun. One detail, often overlooked, is the mention of elephants. Plato describes the island as being full of them, roaming freely across its fields. Now, that raises questions. Because elephants aren't native to most of the places people have proposed, but they were found in North Africa, and on islands like Malta, Cyprus and Crete, dwarf elephants once lived during the Pleistocene. Perhaps that's a clue, or perhaps it's just Plato borrowing from known fauna to flesh out his imagined world. Here's an odd side note for your drowsy brain. The word Atlantis itself may not have originated with Plato. Some scholars suggest it was derived from Atlas, the titan who held up the heavens. Others think it was a poetic invention. But if you look closely at ancient maps, especially those created in the early modern era, you'll find names like Atlantis Major or Atlanticus Oceanus. The legend found its way into cartography, even if no one could agree where to draw the borders, and this is where things start to blur. Over time, the tale of Atlantis began to take on a life of its own. Writers added details, explorers claimed sightings, occultists insisted on secret knowledge. The original source, just a few pages of Plato, became stretched, copied, transformed. It's a little like waking up from a dream and trying to remember it. Each time you tell it, you add a little, smooth a detail, sharpen another. Before long, it's hard to say what was real and what was added in the telling. But that's the paradox of Atlantis. The more we search for it, the further it seems to recede. And yet, we can't stop searching. Because hidden in the folds of Plato's words is a strange seduction, a promise that something lies just out of reach. Not only a city, but a truth about ourselves. Maybe that's what kept Solon up at night. Maybe that's what led Plato to write it down. And maybe that's why, even now, you find yourself lying still, eyes fluttering, wondering not just where Atlantis might be, but what it might mean. Because the legend of Atlantis is not just about a place. It's about memory, power, loss, and the thin, shifting boundary between history and imagination. So let's keep going. Let's walk further into the maze. There are more clues ahead, some geological, some mythical, some lost in translation, but all of them somehow still echo with the same impossible name, Atlantis. Let's go back further, beyond Plato, beyond Solon, beyond the fall of any known city or the rise of any known king, back to Egypt, to a temple in the city of Sais, nestled in the Nile Delta, where a Greek lawmaker is said to have heard whispers of a world long gone. This is where the story of Atlantis truly begins, or at least where Plato claims it begins. According to his dialogue, the Athenian statesman Solon visited Egypt around 600 BCE, seeking wisdom. He met with priests at the Temple of Neith, the Egyptian goddess of war and wisdom. These priests, said to be masters of ancient knowledge, supposedly laughed when Solon boasted about the greatness of Greece. "You Greeks are like children," they told him. "You have no old stories, no memory of what once was." They then told him of Atlantis, a vast civilization, older than any in Greece, that had risen and fallen long before Athens was even a thought in the mind of a god. They said it had existed 9,000 years earlier, in an age when Athens itself had been a great power, and had heroically repelled the Atlantean invaders before both civilizations were swallowed by cataclysm. It's a grand tale, almost too grand, and yet it's presented not as myth, but as inherited fact. That's what makes it so compelling. But how much can we trust it? The Temple of Neith was real. The city of Sais was an important religious centre in ancient Egypt, especially during the 26th dynasty, when Greek visitors were increasingly common. Solon's journey to Egypt isn't outlandish. It fits the timeline, and Greek philosophers often sought wisdom abroad. The Egyptians too had a long tradition of priestly knowledge, records kept on papyrus scrolls, stashed in sacred libraries, tended by scribes trained across generations. But here's where things begin to wobble. We don't have any Egyptian text that mentions Atlantis. No hieroglyph, no scroll, no carving on a temple wall. If such a record existed, it has been lost, or perhaps it never existed at all. All we have is Plato's word that Solon heard this story, and that Plato's own ancestor, also named Critias, passed it down through the family. A long game of historical telephone. Historians are still debating whether Plato invented the entire Egyptian source, using it as a literary device to lend authority to his message. Others argue that he might have been referring obliquely to Egyptian flood myths or oral traditions now lost to time, because Egypt did have flood stories. In fact, nearly every ancient culture has them. The tale of a vast flood wiping away humanity is found in Mesopotamian cuneiform texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Indian Vedic texts, in Chinese legends, and of course in the biblical account of Noah. Could Plato have woven the Atlantis myth from such universal memories? Maybe. But there's another possibility, one that geologists find far more intriguing. What if ancient Egyptians did preserve memories of past catastrophes, not as detailed records but as cultural echoes of real events? Catastrophic flooding of the Nile, earthquakes, shifts in sea level. Perhaps the priests of Sais didn't speak of Atlantis directly, but of a distant land swallowed by the sea, a memory blurred by time, embroidered by storytellers. It wouldn't be the first time oral tradition outlived the evidence. Here's an odd and oddly comforting fact. Australian Aboriginal cultures have oral histories of sea level, rise from over 7,000 years ago, tales of coastlines that vanished, islands that drowned, rivers that changed course. Geologists later confirmed that the events these stories describe actually happened. The landscape did change, the ocean did rise. Somehow the memory survived. So why couldn't something similar have happened in Egypt? There's also the matter of Egyptian cosmology, the idea of an original mound emerging from chaotic waters, of cycles of creation and destruction. These were not unfamiliar concepts, nor was the idea of lost knowledge. In fact, Egyptian myths speak of periods of darkness, of rulers falling from divine favour, of great transitions between ages. Could Solon have misunderstood what he heard? Or did Plato stretch the memory, transforming a hazy recollection into a parable of moral decline and divine punishment? The priests of Sais are long gone. The temple itself lies in ruins, much of its stones scavenged for later buildings. No papyrus has emerged with the tale of Atlantis, but we're left with an image, a Greek lawmaker, standing under the cool columns of an Egyptian sanctuary, listening to an ancient voice speak of a time before time. It's haunting. Because whether or not the story is true, it carries a deeper truth, the sense that civilizations rise, fall, and disappear. That memory fades, that we are not the first to stand at the edge of forgetting. And this brings us to a larger question. If a civilization did vanish 9,000 years before Solon, what kind of civilization could that have been? Would it leave ruins, artifacts, language? Could a complex society truly rise so early and then vanish so completely? Here the timeline becomes our next puzzle. You see, according to Plato, Atlantis fell 9,000 years before Solon's journey, so roughly around 9,600 BCE. That places its destruction near the end of the last ice age, during a period known as the Younger Dryas, when the Earth underwent rapid climate fluctuations. It's a curious coincidence. Around this time, the world was indeed changing dramatically. Glaciers were melting, sea levels were rising, sometimes by as much as 10 meters in a single millennium. Coastal lands were being submerged, habitable areas were shifting. It was an age of upheaval. And here's the twist. We now know that humans were more advanced during this time than we once believed. In southeastern Turkey, archaeologists discovered Göbekli Tepe, a massive stone temple complex built around 9,600 BCE. That's thousands of years before Stonehenge or the Egyptian pyramids. Built not by farmers, but by hunter-gatherers. No cities, no writing, but monumental architecture all the same. Intricate carvings, circular enclosures, astronomical alignments. So yes, something was happening in that deep past. Something we still don't fully understand. It doesn't prove Atlantis existed, but it reminds us that our picture of prehistory is far from complete, and perhaps that's what Plato or Solon or the Egyptian priests were trying to say. That history is deeper than we imagine, that memory is fragile, that somewhere, far in the past, something was lost. You can almost see Solon pausing in the temple's shadowed courtyard, wondering what else might lie buried in the silence, and you, drifting now somewhere between sleep and thought, may wonder too. What voices were drowned by time? What cities sleep beneath the sea? The trouble with memory is that it stretches. It warps and shrinks and folds over itself like old parchment. So when Plato tells us that Atlantis vanished 9,000 years before Solon's time, we pause. Not because it's a shocking claim, though it is, but because it breaks everything we think we know about the timeline of civilization. If we take the number at face value, Atlantis would have been destroyed around 9,600 BCE. That's thousands of years before the Great Pyramid, before Sumer, before the wheel or writing or bronze. In mainstream archaeology, this is the period of the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. Humanity was still a scattered collection of hunter-gatherers, slowly learning to tame crops and animals. Villages were rare, cities didn't exist. The idea of a maritime empire seems unlikely. And yet, that's precisely the date Plato gives. Is it a mistake? Some say yes. One theory suggests that the Egyptian priests may have said 900 years, not 9,000, but that something was lost in translation. You see, the Egyptians used hieroglyphs for both words and numbers, and their numerical system was not always easy to interpret, especially across languages. A small error in copying or interpreting a glyph could easily multiply a number tenfold. 900 years before Solon would put Atlantis around 1500 BCE, much more plausible, historically speaking, right in the window of the Bronze Age collapse, right in the age of great empires falling. But Plato is explicit. He repeats the number, 9,000 years, not once, but several times across Timaeus and Critias. Could he have invented it for dramatic effect? Perhaps. Or perhaps he genuinely believed the priest's account, without realizing the number was symbolic, mythological, or simply confused. Historians are still debating whether the timeline in Plato's text is literal, allegorical, or a transcription error amplified through centuries of retelling. Yet here's the strange part. The year 9600 BCE is not just a random date. In geology, it marks the end of the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate change when the world transitioned from an ice age to something closer to modern conditions. Sea levels were rising, ice sheets were melting, enormous glacial lakes were bursting, sending torrents of water across continents. It was an age of flood. In North America, for example, Lake Agassiz, larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, suddenly drained, possibly contributing to rising sea levels and atmospheric shifts. In Europe, shorelines were redrawn. Vast tracts of land were swallowed by the sea, never to return. Is it possible that ancient peoples retained a cultural memory of these changes? That stories of lost lands and rising waters were passed down orally for thousands of years? It seems far-fetched. And yet, as we've seen, Aboriginal Australians have preserved such memories for millennia. So have coastal tribes in the Pacific Northwest, whose flood stories correspond to geological events now confirmed by science. And here's another peculiar example: Doggerland. Today, if you sail across the North Sea between Britain and the Netherlands, you'll see only waves. But during the Mesolithic, that area was dry land, a vast plain of rivers, forests and lakes, home to hunters and gatherers who left behind flint tools and animal bones. Then, slowly, it began to vanish. Rising seas crept inland. Rivers changed course. Eventually a tsunami triggered by the Storegga Slide, an enormous underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, finished the job. Doggerland disappeared. For centuries, fishermen pulled mammoth tusks and stone tools from the seafloor without understanding where they came from. Only recently has sonar mapping revealed traces of this submerged world. A lost land, a rising sea, a population displaced, not Atlantis, but something like it. And it happened roughly when Plato said Atlantis fell. Coincidence? Perhaps. But for those drawn to the idea of a real Atlantis, this timing is tantalizing. Could there have been a prehistoric culture, coastal, seafaring, semi-advanced, that lived on land now beneath the sea? Not a high-tech empire, not a nation of flying ships and lasers, but a people who knew the tides, mapped the stars, and built structures now hidden by sand and silt. The answer is, maybe. Because the deeper we dig, the more we find that human prehistory is not as empty as we once believed. Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, remains the most provocative example. Built around 9,600 BCE, it challenges the idea that complex structures came only after agriculture. No, this temple, if that's what it was constructed by hunter-gatherers. It was built with knowledge, with vision, with purpose, and then it was buried, on purpose. Why? No one knows. Archaeologists are still trying to make sense of it, but one thing is clear: humans were capable of more, earlier, than our textbooks once claimed. The idea of an unknown culture leaving few traces is no longer absurd. Here's an off-topic fact just to keep your thoughts slippery. The Sahara Desert, now a parched expanse of sand and rock, was once a green savanna dotted with lakes and rivers. Cave paintings from 10,000 years ago show hippos, crocodiles, and people swimming. This region, known as the Green Sahara, may have supported vast populations before desertification set in. Some speculate that stories of lost cities in the sands could refer to this forgotten chapter. Time, it turns out, is an eraser with a very long reach. So when we ask whether Atlantis could have existed 9,600 years ago, we must be careful not to dismiss the possibility outright. Not because we have hard evidence, but because the world was undergoing real cataclysmic change at exactly that time. And memories of catastrophe have a way of persisting. Imagine a coastal society watching the sea slowly claim their land, watching rivers rise, fertile plains vanish, mountains become islands. The elders whisper stories, the children grow up hearing them, then they move inland. The stories change, harden, take on symbols, cities of gold, wrathful gods. One day becomes a night, a myth is born. And perhaps many generations later, a traveller hears the story again, beneath the cool columns of a temple in Egypt, and writes it down in a foreign tongue, never knowing how old it really is. It wouldn't be the first time a myth began in memory, and it won't be the last. So as you lie here, listening to the tides of time lap gently against your imagination, remember this: the truth isn't always buried in stone. Sometimes it lingers in numbers, dates, timelines that don't quite line up. Fragments, shadows, echoes, and sometimes the real mystery isn't whether the timeline is right, it's whether we're ready to remember what we lost. Not all lost worlds are imaginary. Some are real, buried in ash or stone or sea. And among the ruins that sleep beneath the Aegean waves lies a city that might just be Atlantis in disguise. Its name is Thera, or, as it's known today, Santorini. You've probably seen it in postcards. Whitewashed buildings clinging to cliffs, blue domes shining like inverted skies, caldera waters lapping gently at their feet. But this quiet island hides one of the most violent eruptions in human history. Around 1600 BCE, a volcano tore itself apart here, in an explosion so vast it hollowed out the island, launched ash across continents, and brought an entire civilization to its knees. That civilization was the Minoans. The Minoans were among the earliest advanced cultures in Europe, flourishing on the island of Crete and across the Aegean. They built multi-story palaces with intricate plumbing, paved roads, and vibrant frescoes. Their art showed dolphins, acrobats, and priestesses, not war. They were seafarers, traders, and perhaps even inventors of some form of early writing. But they were also deeply connected to Thera. Archaeologists have uncovered a remarkable city beneath the ash on Santorini, at a site called Akrotiri. Streets, homes, pottery, beds, even frescoes frozen in place by the volcanic tomb that entombed them. The site is often compared to Pompeii, though it is far older, and there's something haunting about it. No bodies were found in the ruins, no treasure, just empty buildings, perfectly preserved, as if the people saw it coming and left. Here's the part that matters. The eruption of Thera was colossal, one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human memory. Some estimates suggest it released more energy than 40 atomic bombs. The explosion caused massive tsunamis, which likely devastated coastal settlements across the eastern Mediterranean. Ash darkened the sky, crops failed, trade collapsed, and for the Minoans, it may have spelled the beginning of the end. Historians still debate whether the eruption directly caused the collapse of Minoan civilization. Some argue it was the final blow in a series of disasters. Others suggest the Mycenaeans, rising warriors from mainland Greece, took advantage of Minoan weakness to conquer them, but few doubt that Thera changed everything. Could this be the real Atlantis? On the surface, the parallels are striking. A powerful island civilization, a sudden catastrophe, a disappearance. Even the architecture of Akrotiri, with its circular layouts and advanced engineering, has prompted comparisons to Plato's concentric ring city. In fact, this theory became especially popular in the 20th century, championed by scholars like Spiridon Marinatos, who began excavating Akrotiri in the 1960s. He believed that the Thera eruption had not only inspired Plato's tale, but that traces of the real Atlantis could be found in the ash-choked streets of Akrotiri. And yet, there are problems. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. Thera is firmly within the Mediterranean. The timeline is off too. Thera erupted around 1600 BCE. That's 8,000 years after Plato's claimed destruction date. Even if we accept a mistranslation of Egyptian numerals, it's a stretch. Still, the allure of Thera remains, because it is real. It is a city drowned by disaster, a moment of beauty caught mid-breath, like a dream interrupted by thunder. And for many, it represents how myth and history can dance together, one taking its shape from the other, like light reflecting on water. And maybe that's the key. Maybe Atlantis was never meant to be one place, one city, one date. Maybe it's a memory stitched from many cloths. Thera gives us a glimpse of what a real Atlantis might look like. Not a fairy tale, but a thriving civilization suddenly erased. A place where ash preserves art, where silence tells a story louder than stone. And for those who walk its pathways today, carefully excavated, protected beneath modern roofs, it's easy to imagine the lives once lived there. The woman grinding barley in the morning, the child watching dolphins from a rooftop, the priestess walking barefoot across painted floors, then a tremor, a roar, darkness at noon, and silence. There's something humbling about Thera, something that makes you pause, because it reminds us that nature doesn't care about our golden walls, our clever plumbing, or our temples to the gods. In a single moment, everything can change, and if you're listening closely now, you can almost hear it. The sound of ash falling gently on clay rooftops, the slow exhale of a mountain breaking open. Thera isn't just an archaeological site, it's a warning. And perhaps that's what Plato was trying to say all along, that civilizations fall not just from war or greed, but from the earth itself, that the world beneath our feet shifts, cracks, explodes, that nothing is permanent, not palaces, not ports, not even memory. But here's an odd fact to dream on. The eruption at Thera may have inspired more than just Plato's myth. Some scholars believe it left echoes in the story of Moses and the plagues of Egypt, in the tale of Atlantis, in Greek legends of Deucalion's flood, maybe even in the mythology of distant cultures whose ancestors watched the sky darken without ever knowing why. Volcanoes don't just change the landscape, They change stories. So was Thera Atlantis. Most mainstream archaeologists say no. The location is wrong. The timeline doesn't match. The scale is smaller. But still, it stands as a testament to how the past leaves its fingerprints, smudged, scattered, but still visible. And for those lying in bed tonight letting the images drift through the quiet corners of the mind, it offers a rare kind of comfort. Atlantis may be elusive, but Thera is real, tangible, knowable, a reminder that even legends have ancestors in the ground. And who's to say that Atlantis wasn't many places, many cities, many stories, all gathered under one name, Atlantis, a memory written in ash. Plato is specific. He places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles. That phrase might sound poetic, even a bit vague, but to the ancient Greeks, it had a very real geographic meaning. The Pillars of Heracles, or the Pillars of Hercules as they're more commonly called today, refer to two great promontories flanking the entrance to the Atlantic Ocean, the Rock of Gibraltar in Europe and Jebel Musa in North Africa. To Greek sailors of the classical era, these two cliffs marked the edge of the known world. Beyond them was the endless Atlantic, what they called the Ocean Sea, the place where sea monsters were said to dwell, the place from which no one returned, a watery frontier that swallowed ships, secrets, and maybe cities. So if we take Plato literally, then Atlantis was not in the Aegean, or the Mediterranean, or buried beneath a volcano. It was somewhere past the gateway, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And for centuries that simple phrase, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, has driven countless explorers westward. But is it really that simple? Historians are still debating whether Plato's pillars always meant Gibraltar. The identification became common in later Greek and Roman writing, but earlier uses of the term were sometimes more metaphorical. Heracles, after all, was a mythological figure, a demigod known for his strength and his far-flung labours. Some scholars argue that Plato may have been using the phrase allegorically, or even referring to another geographic location entirely. Others suggest that the pillars could have referred to other straits, like the straits near the island of Euboea, or between Sicily and Tunisia. After all, the boundaries of the world were a lot fuzzier before the age of accurate cartography. Still, Gibraltar remains the most widely accepted candidate. And if we go along with it, then Plato is telling us quite clearly, Atlantis lay in the Atlantic Ocean, which raises an intriguing possibility. If Atlantis was real, and if it was in the Atlantic, then what are we looking for? An island? A continent? A chain of seamounts? Plato says Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. That's enormous, implausibly so. But again, translations vary. The Greek word for Asia may have referred only to a small region of Anatolia, and Libya might have meant just North Africa west of Egypt. Still large, but not global in scale. He also describes the island as having a central city, with concentric rings of land and water, protected by canals and walls. This capital was located on a vast fertile plain, rich in rivers and framed by mountains. In short, it was an ideal landscape, a place of abundance, beauty, and power. So we look west, and what do we find? The Azores, a group of islands far out in the Atlantic belonging to Portugal today. They rise dramatically from the seafloor, formed by volcanic activity at the junction of three tectonic plates. Some enthusiasts point to submerged features around the islands as possible evidence of sunken structures. Others dismiss these as natural formations, seamounts, fault lines, lava flows. Geologists argue that the mid-Atlantic ridge, where the Azores sit, is geologically active, but not in a way that would suddenly submerge a continent. Continents don't just drop into the ocean. That's not how plate tectonics works. Oceanic crust is too dense to support the kind of landmass Plato described, but what if we're looking too literally? Here's a peculiar fact. During the last ice age, sea levels were over 100 metres lower than they are today. Entire stretches of coastline were exposed, land bridges connected islands and continents. Shallow seas now covering vast shelves with dry land. Could Atlantis have been one of these now submerged areas? Doggerland, between Britain and mainland Europe, is a good example. As we saw, it was a thriving landscape before it drowned. The Bahama Banks, parts of Southeast Asia, and regions along the West African coast all were once larger, drier, and more habitable than they are today. Could there have been a forgotten landmass in the Atlantic? The area near the Madeira Abyssal Plain, for instance, has long fascinated researchers. Some have claimed to find underwater features resembling roads, walls, even pyramid-like shapes. But when investigated more closely, these often turn out to be geological formations, fractures in the basaltic crust tricking the eye. Even so, the myth persists, because Plato didn't just say Atlantis sank, he said it did so in a single day and night. That's not gradual sea level rise, that's catastrophe. Earthquakes, floods, a world-ending event, and while such sudden destruction is rare, it's not impossible. Submarine landslides, massive volcanic eruptions, tsunamis triggered by shifting tectonic plates, these things have happened. The Storegga slide off Norway, the Krakatoa eruption in Indonesia, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. All are examples of violent, fast-moving geological disasters that changed coastlines and erased communities. So it's not unthinkable that a thriving coastal culture might vanish in the blink of a geologic eye. But would that culture leave no trace? Here we hit the problem again. We have no artifacts, no ruins, no inscriptions, just a description in a dialogue and a string of perhapses. Still, there's something seductive about the Western Sea. Even the Romans believed in islands beyond the horizon. Antillia, Brazil, the Isles of the Blessed. And later, medieval cartographers drew phantom islands in the Atlantic, places whispered about by sailors who saw shapes on foggy mornings and lights on empty nights. And here's an odd little fact to drift off with. In the 15th century, Portuguese explorers believed they had discovered remnants of Atlantis in the Azores. They found strange stone structures on some of the islands, walls, terraces, causeways. Today we know these were probably built by early settlers, or are just natural basalt formations. But for those first navigators, these stones spoke of something older, something forgotten. So tonight, you might imagine those ancient sailors pushing west into unknown waters, their wooden ships creaking, their sails straining. Behind them, Europe. Ahead of them, fog. Beneath them, the deep blue mystery of the Atlantic. Somewhere out there, perhaps, was the city that fell, and as you drift into sleep, picture the pillars behind you. Picture the edge of the known world slipping past, and the waves murmuring secrets to those who dare to listen. Beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the maps end, where Atlantis begins. The truth, they say, is in the details. But the devil lives there too, and when it comes to Atlantis, one of the slipperiest details is a simple number, 9,000. That's how many years before Solon's time the Egyptian priests said Atlantis had fallen. That number changes everything. It stretches the story into the remote reaches of prehistory, far beyond the borders of recorded civilization, and it raises a question that has never quite been answered. Was it a mistake? Some believe it was. Not a malicious error, but a subtle one, born of scribes and translators, priests and philosophers, copying texts across cultures and centuries. A small error, maybe, but one that shaped 2,000 years of speculation. Let's follow the trail. The original claim comes from Plato, quoting Critias, who quotes Solon, who, allegedly, heard it from Egyptian priests. The priests, Plato says, read from sacred scrolls, recounting a story written in their own language. Solon, a Greek, was dependent on translation. Later, Plato would be dependent on oral memory passed down through generations of his own family. Somewhere in that fragile chain, numbers were spoken, repeated, remembered, and recorded. And numbers, of all things, are the easiest to bend. The ancient Egyptian numerical system was not like ours. They didn't use base 10 place value like we do today. Instead, they relied on hieroglyphs, distinct symbols representing units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and so on. These symbols, when copied or interpreted hastily, could lead to significant misunderstandings. A glyph for 100 might be confused with 1,000. A plural mark might multiply things tenfold. Scholars argue that it wouldn't take much to turn 900 into 9,000. Historians are still debating whether Plato's figures reflect a translation error, or if he simply chose a symbolic number to add grandeur to his narrative. Because in Greek literature, numbers were rarely used casually. The number 9,000 might not mean exactly 9,000. It could symbolize antiquity, a mythic past, or a time long enough ago that no one would remember clearly. It might have meant a long time ago, more than a precise calendar date. Then again, Plato was precise in other aspects of his Atlantis account. He provided measurements in stadia, described the geometry of the city, even detailed the dimensions of canals and temples. This level of technical detail sits uneasily beside such a potentially vague or mistranslated date. So which is it? If it was 900 years before Solon, that would place the destruction of Atlantis around 1500 BCE. And that's a very different landscape. That's the height of the Bronze Age, when the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Egyptians and Hittites were all flourishing. It's a time we understand fairly well, a time of palaces and war chariots, of trade routes and empires. That's also the same period when Thera erupted. The timelines would align, the archaeological evidence would make more sense. Suddenly Atlantis looks less like an Ice Age anomaly, and more like a poetic description of a real disaster, stylized and exaggerated by Plato. But what if the number was correct? That would place Atlantis around 9600 BCE, deep in the Neolithic. That's before cities, before writing, before metallurgy. But as we've seen, it's also the era of Göbekli Tepe, of rising sea levels, of climate upheaval. An era when human activity was more complex than we once thought. Perhaps not empire-level complex, but rich in knowledge we're only beginning to rediscover. Here's an off-topic curiosity to entertain your drifting thoughts. The Mayan calendar, when backdated from its mythical zero date, begins in 3114 BCE. Sumerian kings are said to have reigned for thousands of years before the flood. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, cycles of time stretching into tens of thousands of years. These cultures weren't interested in short timelines. To them, deep antiquity was the rule, not the exception. Could Plato have been channeling something similar? A distant memory from a forgotten time framed in Greek philosophical terms, but rooted in much older storytelling traditions? Possibly. But there's another twist. Plato never finished Critias. The dialogue cuts off mid-sentence, just as the story is reaching its climax. We never hear the full fall of Atlantis. We never see the resolution. This has led some to suggest that Plato intended to expand the story, or that he left it unfinished on purpose, as a kind of intellectual cliffhanger. Others believe it's simply a fragment, lost like so many ancient texts. Whatever the reason, the incompleteness leaves us adrift. We're left with dates we can't trust, places we can't confirm, and a narrative that hovers somewhere between myth and history. Yet, that hasn't stopped the search. Because numbers have power. They suggest precision, even when none exists. 9,000 years carries weight. It feels ancient, untouchable, distant enough that no one can disprove it. And maybe that's the point. We want Atlantis to be old, older than Egypt, older than Sumer, older than anything we know. We want it to be the root of all roots, the place from which all others fell. So even if the number is a mistranslation, we hold on to it, because it feels right. And here's a sleepy thought to close with. What if both timelines are true? What if Atlantis is not one civilization, but many layered myths? What if Plato's date points to a memory of a lost world at the end of the Ice Age, preserved vaguely in temple lore, while the details of his Atlantis city are drawn from more recent Mediterranean cultures, like the Minoans or the Egyptians, a palimpsest of disaster and splendour rewritten across centuries? The numbers won't tell us. They never do. They're shadows on the wall, but they still lead us forward. So let them guide you now, across a soft sea of thought, where the line between 900 and 9,000 dissolves like mist, and the only number that matters is the one that haunts your imagination. One night, one city, one story that refuses to sink. Plato lingers on a detail most readers skip, a curious phrase nestled in his description of the aftermath once Atlantis had disappeared. He writes that the area where the island had once been became impassable and impenetrable, filled with a shoal of mud which hindered navigation, a sea no longer open to sailors, a watery grave marked not by ruins but by silt. This single line has fascinated researchers for generations, because Plato doesn't just say the island vanished. He claims it left behind a scar, a physical change in the sea, a place too thick with debris for ships to cross. Could this be literal? Or, like so much of the Atlantis story, was it meant to be metaphor? Some theorists take Plato at his word. They believe he was referring to a real location where the seafloor became treacherous, choked by underwater landslides, sunken landforms, or vast mudflats. And one such place often mentioned is the region around southern Spain, near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. There, not far from the modern city of Cádiz, lies Doñana National Park, a vast marshland of shifting sands, wetlands, and muddy tidal flats. Some researchers believe this could be the area Plato meant. Not an ocean in the deep Atlantic, but a once dry floodplain that became waterlogged and nearly impassable. It's a bold idea, and one that's drawn both serious investigation and heavy skepticism. In the early 2000s, a Spanish researcher named Dr. Richard Freund led a multidisciplinary team to survey the Doñana region using ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery. What they claimed to find were circular patterns buried beneath the mud. Rings, they said, that resembled Plato's description of Atlantis' concentric layout. Columns, temples, foundations of unknown age. The media response was immediate. Headlines declared that Atlantis had finally been found in the marshes of Spain. Documentaries aired, maps were redrawn, and yet, most archaeologists were not convinced. Historians are still debating whether the formations were man-made or natural, part of ancient Roman settlements, Islamic irrigation systems, or even just geological quirks. No definitive artifacts from 9,000 years ago were found. No temples, no inscriptions, just patterns in the mud. Which raises a question. What does mud mean in Plato's story? Is it literal silt? The aftermath of an earthquake and flood that stirred up sediment and buried the ruins in a kind of liquefied grave? Or could mud mean confusion, obscurity, a metaphor for knowledge lost? Because Plato didn't just write as a historian, he wrote as a philosopher. He understood symbols, and to say that the sea became impassable might be his way of saying the truth became hidden, buried, unreachable, lost beneath layers of myth and misinformation. Still, the marsh theory is compelling. The geography fits. The plain is vast, as Plato described. It lies not far from the Strait of Gibraltar, within plausible range of beyond the pillars, and the region was known to the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, who may have had their own stories of sunken lands and flood myths. Moreover, the area has a long human history. Nearby Tartessos, a mysterious Bronze Age civilization mentioned in Greek and Roman texts, was once thought to be a candidate for Atlantis. Known for its wealth, metallurgy, and trade with the ancient world, Tartessos vanished from historical records sometime around 500 BCE. It was said to lie near the Atlantic coast of Iberia. Its capital has never been definitively located. So could the Tartessians have been the real Atlanteans? Or, at the very least, the inspiration behind the story? It's tempting. Their land was rich, their knowledge was advanced, their disappearance is mysterious, and it all happened just in time for the story to be passed to Solon. But again, there's no mud-covered temple waiting to be unearthed. Not yet. Here's a peculiar aside to soften the edge of skepticism. Archaeologists have recently uncovered entire ancient cities buried under swamp and lake in other parts of the world. In Mexico, the Maya city of Yaxuna lay hidden under forest and jungle. In India, the city of Dwarka, long thought mythical, was discovered beneath shallow coastal waters, its walls, steps and stones still intact beneath layers of sediment. It happens, the earth moves, the sea reclaims, and over time what was solid becomes soft. A palace becomes a pond, a wall becomes a ripple in the soil. So maybe, just maybe, Plato's muddy sea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Maybe there really is a region where the ground shifted, the sea encroached, and a city was buried. Not under waves, but under silt. A place too messy, too uncertain for ancient ships to cross. A landscape forgotten not by fire or war, but by slow, wet decay. And perhaps that's why Atlantis remains so elusive. Because we keep looking for stone ruins, for golden thrones and shining temples. But what if all that's left is mud, unremarkable, undramatic, slow? It would be ironic, wouldn't it? That one of the greatest legends in human memory, an empire of grandeur and power, was brought down not by divine wrath, but by slow sediment and soft rain. Mud is patient. It doesn't roar like fire or crash like waves. It just gathers, layer upon layer, year after year, until everything beneath it is hidden. And here's a final sleepy thought. In literature, mud is often where heroes begin. In the clay of creation myths, in the silt of riverbeds, in the dust from which stories are born. Perhaps that's true of Atlantis too. not a city above the clouds, but a whisper in the wet earth, waiting to be sifted. Plato, ever the dramatist, knew that stories stick best when they shimmer, and so he painted Atlantis not only as powerful, but dazzling. The island, he wrote, was rich in resources, opulent in design, extravagant in every dimension. Its palaces were plated in gold, its temples shone with metals now lost to time, its kings bathed in luxury, and its navy, he claimed, numbered 1,000 ships. Even the animals were impressive. Herds of elephants roamed the fertile plains. It was a paradise, and then it sank. So tonight, let's wander through this glittering memory. Let's follow Plato's footsteps into a world of impossible wealth, and ask, softly, sleepily, where is the proof? According to the dialogues, the Atlanteans were blessed by nature. The central island was a marvel, abundant in fresh water, fruit-bearing trees, wild animals, hot springs, and rare metals. There was gold, of course, always gold, but more intriguingly, Plato mentioned orichalcum, a mysterious alloy that gleamed like fire and was second only to gold in value. No one really knows what orichalcum was. The word appears in a few other ancient texts, often as a poetic term for mountain copper or a red gold metal. Some believe it was a real substance, an alloy of copper and zinc similar to brass. Others think it was purely symbolic, a metal of myth, as intangible as the city it adorned. But in 2015, archaeologists dredging near Sicily recovered several ingots of what they identified as orichalcum from a 2,600-year-old shipwreck. The composition? Mostly copper, with traces of zinc and other elements. Could this have been the very metal Plato meant, or just another coincidence dressed in glitter? Historians are still debating whether Plato's orichalcum referred to a real alloy, or simply a poetic embellishment. As for the elephants, Plato describes them as numerous on the island, living in harmony with other creatures in a verdant paradise. Now, this is odd, because elephants, while native to Africa and parts of Asia, weren't exactly common in the Atlantic. Fossils of ancient elephants have been found on Mediterranean islands like Crete and Malta, dwarf species, long extinct. Could Plato have heard of these remains? Could the presence of tusks in strange places have sparked the idea that great beasts once roamed a lost island? Or perhaps the elephant, like so much else in the story, is symbolic, a marker of might, of scale, of exoticism. Then there's the architecture. Plato described the city as a series of concentric rings, alternating water and land, joined by bridges and canals, guarded by towers, and adorned with temples. The central temple of Poseidon, he says, was a colossal structure, sheathed in silver, its pinnacles reaching into the sky. Statues of the sea god surrounded it, including one of Poseidon himself riding 6 winged horses. Winged horses. Elephants. Flaming metal. It begins to feel more like a dream than a report. Still, the concept of a concentric city is not unheard of in ancient urban planning. Some pre-Columbian settlements in the Americas use circular layouts. Certain North African sites, like the ruins near Risha in Mauritania, mirror the pattern, at least from above. Even some prehistoric European hill forts were designed with rings of defence. But a city that size, with those materials? No trace has ever been found. No golden tiles, no glittering temples, no buried navy. And yet, the description lingers in the imagination like a sunset that refuses to fade, because there's something intoxicating about the image of a lost world that was not simply wise or powerful, but beautiful, rich, impossible. Here's an odd and slightly sobering fact. Throughout history, legends of golden cities have driven real people to ruin. Think of El Dorado, the fabled kingdom of South America, said to be paved with gold. Spanish conquistadors hunted it for decades, draining lakes, killing indiscriminately, lost in obsession. Not a single gold-paved street was ever found. We repeat this pattern over and over, because we want to believe in golden cities. We want them to be real, because they make the world feel deeper, older, more mysterious, because they suggest that beauty and glory have existed before and might exist again. That's what Atlantis offers. Not just a lost civilization, but a perfect one. A dream of harmony between nature and technology, of spiritual wisdom and worldly power. A place that had it all, and then lost it all. But here lies the irony. Plato's Atlantis was not meant to be a utopia. It was a warning. He describes the Atlanteans as noble and pure at first, but over time they become greedy, arrogant, and decadent. Their riches rot them from within. Their golden walls cannot protect them from moral collapse, and in the end, it is this downfall that brings destruction. Earthquakes and floods are merely the final punctuation on a sentence already written in pride. So perhaps the riches of Atlantis are not evidence but metaphor. They are the bait in the trap, the shimmer that blinds us to the message beneath. Historians are still debating whether Plato's account of Atlantis was based on a real place or entirely fictional, but few doubt the moral behind it. Great civilizations can fall, and often they fall not because of enemies or disasters, but because of themselves. So as you lie there now, gently untethered from the weight of the day, think of Atlantis not as a place, but as a mirror, a reflection of us, of our dreams, of our warnings. We build, we shine, we grow, and sometimes we fall. But the stories remain. Somewhere beneath the waves, in the dark folds of memory, the golden city still glows, if only in the mind, and maybe that's enough. Now let's sail farther, past the known and the plausible, past the pillars and past Plato, far into the foggy waters of speculation, where the map of the world blurs at the edges and the compass needle trembles. Because there is one theory that takes Atlantis to the very end of the earth, to Antarctica. Yes, that Antarctica, the white continent, the icy void at the bottom of the globe where penguins waddle and research stations blink under perpetual cold. The place we think we know and yet never truly see. But beneath all that ice there's rock, and beneath that rock, some say, there may be secrets. The idea first gained traction in the mid-20th century, spurred by the rediscovery of ancient maps. Chief among them was the Piri Reis map, a 1513 world map drawn by an Ottoman admiral, compiled from older sources. It famously shows the coastlines of South America and Africa in surprising detail. But what caught the eye of alternative historians was a strange addition, a stretch of southern landmass that seems to resemble the northern coast of Antarctica, without its ice. Now we know Antarctica has been under ice for at least several million years, so how could a 16th century map show it as ice-free? Some argue it's a misinterpretation or a stylized extension of South America. Others, like Charles Hapgood, believed it was evidence of an ancient seafaring civilization that mapped the Earth long before history began. In 1966, Hapgood published maps of the ancient sea kings, proposing that Antarctica's coast had been surveyed by an unknown culture tens of thousands of years ago, and that this knowledge was passed down through generations of mapmakers, eventually landing on the desk of Admiral Piri Reis. Even Albert Einstein supported the preface of Hapgood's book, though it's unclear whether he agreed with all of its conclusions. Hapgood's theory proposed that a phenomenon called Earth crust displacement, a sudden shift in the Earth's outer shell, caused Antarctica to move rapidly southward, from a temperate location to its current polar state. In this scenario, a civilization based in what was then a habitable Antarctica could have flourished, before being buried under miles of ice. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, and scientifically it's deeply controversial. Historians are still debating whether ancient maps like Piri Reis contain genuine ancient geographic knowledge, or are simply products of imaginative reconstruction. Most geologists reject Earth crust displacement in favour of the more widely accepted theory of plate tectonics, which describes continental drift as a slow, steady process over millions of years, not sudden, catastrophic shifts. Antarctica, they point out, has been in its current location for over 30 million years, and while parts of it may have been forested during earlier epochs, any human civilization would have had to exist well before Homo sapiens even evolved. Still, the mystery of what lies beneath the ice persists. Radar scans of the Antarctic continent have revealed vast mountain ranges, subglacial lakes, and enormous canyons buried beneath up to 4 kilometers of ice. Lake Vostok, for instance, is a liquid lake sealed under ice for possibly 15 million years. What might lie preserved there, fossils, microbes, or something stranger, remains unknown. And because it's unknown, the theories multiply. In the realms of alternative history and fringe speculation, Antarctica becomes the perfect hiding place, a blank canvas onto which anything can be projected, a refuge for Atlanteans, a vault of alien technology, a remnant of an antediluvian world wiped clean by cataclysm. The remoteness, the inaccessibility, the sheer harshness of the landscape, all of it feeds the myth. Here's an odd little fact to lull your thoughts. During World War II, Nazi Germany launched expeditions to Antarctica. In 1938-39, the Schwabenland expedition claimed parts of Queen Maud Land and even dropped swastika-stamped flags from airplanes to assert territorial presence. The stated goal was whaling and exploration, but conspiracy theorists have since woven a web of stories about secret Nazi bases, hidden UFOs, and lost Atlantean technologies buried in the ice. It's pure speculation, but it shows how Antarctica has become a kind of psychic repository, a final frontier where we store our strangest hopes and darkest dreams. Could Atlantis be there? Geologically speaking, unlikely. There's no evidence of any ice-free period in the last 12,000 years that would allow for a flourishing human civilization on the continent. No tools, no ruins, no bones, and yet the ice is thick, deceptively thick, concealing millions of square kilometers of terrain never touched by sunlight or human eyes, which means, of course, that the imagination runs wild. And maybe that's the point. Atlantis has never been just one place. It's wherever we aren't, wherever we can't easily go, the bottom of the sea, the depths of the jungle, the sands of the Sahara, the snows of Antarctica, always slightly out of reach, always shifting. And perhaps it's not about where Atlantis was, but why we keep needing it to exist. Maybe Antarctica, in all its cold silence, reflects something about our relationship to the unknown, a reminder that even in the age of satellites and sonar, there are still places on Earth we do not understand, still blank spots on the map, still stories waiting to be imagined. So as you drift deeper into sleep, picture it. A city buried not in sand or water, but in ice. Frozen towers under glaciers, streets sealed under frost, lights flickering somewhere beneath the aurora australis, a memory encased in cold. Atlantis, the frozen. Atlantis, the impossible. Or perhaps just Atlantis. Somewhere in the warm shallows of the Bahamas, where the sea gleams like liquid turquoise and the sand shifts gently under the waves, lies a strange line of stones. Just off the coast of North Bimini Island, beneath only a few meters of water, this line appears, nearly 800 feet long, shaped like a gentle curve, with large rectangular blocks laid side by side like a broken highway to nowhere. They call it the Bimini Road. To the eye, it looks artificial, as though some ancient builder once paved a grand causeway through the Caribbean, now submerged and half crumbled. The stones are massive, some as long as 13 feet, flat-topped, sharply angled, arranged in a pattern that feels intentional. Some even seem to rest atop smaller stones, like a foundation beneath a floor. It is, unsurprisingly, one of the most controversial underwater sites on Earth. Those who believe in Atlantis have long latched onto Bimini. Its allure began in the 1960s when Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, claimed that Atlantis would rise again near the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969. Just months later, divers stumbled upon this curious formation, half buried in the sea. Was it prophecy fulfilled, or just very good timing? The media exploded. Articles proclaimed the rediscovery of a lost civilization. Photos of the Bimini Road spread around the world. New Age thinkers and amateur archaeologists dove down and returned with stories of submerged temples, lost walls, and Atlantean ruins. But scientists, as they tend to do, were skeptical. Geologists examined the stones and noted that the blocks are beach rock, a type of naturally cemented sediment found all along the Bahamian coast. Beach rock can fracture in neat, angular ways, especially when cracked by tectonic stress. Water movement and erosion can also create the illusion of deliberate placement. In other words, the Bimini Road might be a geological quirk. But here's where it gets murky. Some researchers claim the blocks show signs of human alteration. Tool marks, sharp angles, consistent widths. A few stones seem to rest on other stones like columns or supports. Critics say this is natural undercutting. Proponents say it's too precise, too engineered. Historians are still debating whether the Bimini Road is entirely natural or a natural formation that was later enhanced by human hands. And the waters don't help. The sea erases, smooths, buries. Any evidence of carving or construction could easily have been worn away by centuries of waves. Even the dating is uncertain. Radiocarbon samples from the area suggest the formation is no older than 3,500 years, too recent for Plato's Atlantis. But again, sediment shifts, dates move, and absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Here's an odd tangent for your wandering mind. The Bahamas sit on the edge of the continental shelf, a massive platform of submerged land known as the Bahama Banks. During the last ice age, when sea levels were over 100 meters lower, these banks were dry land, vast and sprawling. Islands would have been larger, the coastlines broader. People could have lived there, travelled there, even built there. And when the ice melted, the sea rose, drowning not just beaches but entire landscapes. So perhaps the Bimini Road is a remnant of that forgotten shoreline. Perhaps it once bordered a settlement now erased. Or perhaps it's just a rocky outcropping, shaped by time and tide, accidentally beautiful. We may never know. But that hasn't stopped the speculation. Other features have been reported near Bimini. Rectangular depressions, walls, even a so-called temple site now hidden by sand. Sonar scans have picked up anomalies. Dives have brought back tantalizing images. Yet nothing definitive has been found. No inscriptions, no statues, no tools, just stones. Silent, massive, unmoved. And so the Bimini Road becomes a kind of Rorschach test for the modern mind. Scientists see geology. Mystics see Atlantis. Everyone sees what they want to see. And maybe that's what gives it power. Because unlike a museum or a manuscript, Bimini isn't locked away. You can swim there. You can glide over it. Feel the sunlight rippling through the water and touch the stones yourself. It's Atlantis at arm's length, close enough to imagine, and that perhaps is more compelling than proof. Here's another curious fact to ponder as your eyes grow heavy. Near Bimini, there are blue holes, underwater sinkholes that plunge hundreds of feet into the earth, filled with ancient secrets. In one, researchers found human bones more than 1,000 years old. In others, rare bacteria survive without oxygen, sealed off from the outside world. These pockets preserve time, like jars of history sealed with water. Who knows what else waits in those depths? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. And so, as you float on the edge of sleep, picture the stones of Bimini glowing gently in the moonlit sea. Picture the divers hovering silently above them, unsure if they are standing on a road or a reef or a dream. Picture the ocean holding its breath. Atlantis may not rise again, but it doesn't have to. Sometimes it's enough just to wonder, to drift along the line between rock and story, and to ask, without needing an answer, who built the road beneath the waves? If you trace your finger southward along the map, past the foggy ruins of Bimini, past the Atlantic waves that whisper like breath against the shore, you will come to a vast desert, the Sahara, dry now, silent, golden. But it wasn't always like this. 10,000 years ago it was a green world. Rivers ran, trees stood, elephants grazed. People lived and wandered beneath monsoons and stars, and nestled in its heart lies a strange spiral carved into the earth. They call it the Rishi structure, or more evocatively, the Eye of the Sahara. From the ground, it's nothing remarkable. A series of hills and ridges scattered and worn by time, but from the air, from the cold, clear eye of a satellite, it becomes something else entirely. A series of concentric rings nearly 50 kilometers wide, rising and falling in quiet symmetry, circles within circles, land and void, like a fingerprint, or the blueprint of a lost city. Some look at it and see geology, a collapsed dome sculpted by erosion, shaped by volcanic breath and water's long patience. Others look at it and see Atlantis. Plato's description of Atlantis' capital city, concentric circles of land and water, has never found a more poetic mirror. The Risha structure fits almost too well. A central island, surrounding channels, an outer ring. Even the scale is eerily close to Plato's measurements, depending on how you translate the ancient Greek units. Coincidence? Maybe. But consider the geography. Mauritania, where the Risha lies, sits on the Atlantic coast, not far south of the Strait of Gibraltar. It's within the plausible range of Plato's Beyond the Pillars of Heracles. In the distant past, when the Sahara was lush, it could have supported agriculture, settlements, even cities. And as the climate shifted, as desert encroached and water retreated, anything built there would have been slowly erased, not by cataclysm, but by heat, by time, by silence. In recent years, a wave of independent researchers, YouTubers, and alternative historians have converged on the Eye of the Sahara. They've measured, mapped, cross-referenced. They've pointed out that Plato's timeline, if taken literally, would place Atlantis during the so-called African humid period, when the Sahara was indeed green. They argue that this was the ideal time and place for a great civilization to flourish. So why don't mainstream archaeologists agree? Because there's no evidence, no pottery shards, no foundations, no tools, no ruins, inscriptions or skeletal remains. Just rock, just wind, just pattern. Historians are still debating whether the Risha structure's resemblance to Atlantis is mere pareidolia, a tendency of the human brain to find patterns where none exist, or something more. But without archaeological support, it remains a beautiful coincidence. Still, coincidences can be powerful. Here's a strange little fact to lull you deeper into thought. The ancient peoples of West Africa have flood myths too. The Dogon of Mali, for example, speak of celestial origins and past worlds erased by water. Some of their lore includes astonishingly precise astronomical knowledge, like the orbit of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye. This has led to theories, widely disputed, that they inherited lost knowledge from a vanished civilization. Now, no one is saying the Dogon are Atlanteans, or that the Eye of the Sahara was once paved with gold, but the presence of these stories, their resonance with myths from Greece, Mesopotamia, and the Americas, suggests something deeper. A shared memory, a flood, a loss, a before. And here's where the story curls back in on itself, like the rings of the eye. Plato said Atlantis fell because it lost its virtue. Its people, once noble, became greedy, proud. They turned away from the divine order, from wisdom and moderation, and the gods punished them, not with fire from the heavens, but with water. Always water. So maybe the story isn't about geography at all. Maybe it's about balance. The Risha structure, whatever its origin, is balanced, harmonious, quiet, a place of slow erosion and long sleep. If something did live there once, if people built or prayed or gathered, those traces are gone now, buried not in mud or ice, but in forgetfulness. And perhaps that's why Atlantis continues to haunt us, because it reminds us how easy it is to forget, how quickly the sands blow over our temples, how a civilization can vanish not in a single day and night, but in 1,000 quiet mornings, one grain at a time. So tonight, picture the eye. Imagine walking across those stone circles, wind in your ears, dust swirling like ghosts around your feet. No walls, no roads, just rhythm, just silence. You're walking through memory, through a place that may never have been a city but still feels like one. And as you close your eyes, you may find that Atlantis is not under the sea, or beneath the ice, or in the mud, but here in the desert, looking up like an eye half closed in dream, watching, waiting, enduring. Long before historians whispered of Atlantis, they were puzzled by something else, a mystery more concrete, more devastating, and in its way, just as haunting. Around 1200 BCE, the world as it was known across the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Great cities burned, empires crumbled, writing systems vanished, trade routes went silent. Egypt survived, barely. The Hittites did not. Mycenaean Greece fell into darkness. The world regressed, and no one knows exactly why. But we have a name for the storm, the Sea Peoples. They appeared suddenly in Egyptian records, inscribed in temples carved into stone like a warning. Pharaoh Ramses III faced them in battle around 1177 BCE. He recorded their invasion in vivid reliefs, ships drawn like birds upon the waves, warriors wearing feathered helmets, wielding spears and round shields. The inscription reads, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms." Who were they? No one truly knows. The term Sea Peoples is a modern convenience, a catch-all for various groups mentioned in Egyptian sources, the Peliset, the Cheka, the Denian, the Sherdan. Some may have come from the Aegean, others from the Levant. They arrived not as raiders, but as waves of displaced populations moving by sea and by land, bringing war and desperation with them. Historians are still debating whether the Sea Peoples were invaders, refugees, or both. Some see them as the cause of the late Bronze Age collapse, others as a symptom, a reaction to climate change, famine, earthquake, or plague. A society in crisis often blames the outsider, the nomad, the stranger on the shore. But what if the sea peoples were more than that? What if they were survivors? Some Atlantologists, those who believe in the physical reality of Atlantis, have wondered whether the sea peoples were echoes of a lost civilization. Not Atlantis directly, perhaps, but its refugees, its remnants, people fleeing a drowned homeland, spreading knowledge, conflict and memory as they moved. It's speculative, and yet, the timing is strange. If Plato's 9,000 years is a mistranslation, if it was meant to be 900 years before Solon, then the fall of Atlantis would place us right here, at the end of the Bronze Age, in the chaos of Mycenaean decline, Hittite collapse, and Egyptian fear. Could Atlantis be a memory of that world? A poetic symbol of the entire system that fell? Because the Bronze Age world was remarkably interconnected. From the palaces of Knossos to the streets of Ugarit, goods and ideas moved fluidly. Ships crossed the sea bearing tin, copper, olive oil, wine. Treaties were written in Akkadian. Letters were exchanged between kings. And then, within decades, it all fell apart. Writing vanished in Greece for 400 years. Palaces were abandoned. Languages died. If Atlantis is a metaphor, it is a fitting one. And here's an odd fact to stir the imagination. Some of the names of the sea peoples resemble known tribes. The Denian may be related to the Danaui, one of the Greek tribal names. The Peliset may be the Philistines, who later appear in the Hebrew Bible. Even the Sherden echo the name Sardinia. Are these coincidences, or faint traces of real migrations? And what of the legend of the Atlanteans invading Athens and being repelled? Plato presents it as a proud moment in Athenian history, though his timeline places it impossibly far in the past. But if you shift the timeline forward to the Bronze Age, the image sharpens. The Mycenaeans fought off raiders. The Egyptians recorded their victory. The sea boiled with war. No wonder memories blurred, or were buried. Because the collapse wasn't just military, it was systemic, a domino effect. Trade collapsed. Cities that relied on imported grain starved. Political alliances disintegrated. In some places, drought may have lasted decades. In others, earthquakes shattered coastal settlements. This was not a single event. It was a slow unweaving of the world, and when the dust settled, much was forgotten. This is where Atlantis might live, not as a real city, but as a wound, a trauma echoing through time, a story told to explain what happens when greatness turns fragile, when complexity outpaces resilience, when civilizations fall, not in fire and glory, but in silence. The sea peoples, in this reading, are not villains. They are messengers, carrying the last breath of something older, something broken. And maybe this is why the story of Atlantis still resonates, because it is not just about pride or punishment, but about collapse, about how quickly the world can change, about how even the most beautiful cities can be reduced to myth. So tonight, picture the ships, not golden or divine, but battered, crewed by men and women who have lost everything, their homes underwater, their gods drowned. They come ashore to strange lands. Some are welcomed, some are fought. Their names are forgotten, their stories become warnings, and Atlantis becomes what all lost worlds become, a question. Not where, but why. Why do we build? Why do we fall? Why do we still dream of the city that sank? Let that question carry you now, softly, across the sea of sleep, past the wreckage of empires, past the silence of ruins, into a place where memory drifts like foam, and every wave whispers a name, Atlantis. And now, your journey stretches westward, across the vast Atlantic to the lands we once called the New World. But long before European ships carved white lines into the ocean, long before names like Columbus or Vespucci were written into maps, these continents were home to civilizations of stunning complexity. The Maya, the Olmec, the Inca, pyramids as tall as Egyptian tombs, roads winding through mountains, cities in the jungle wrapped in mist, and myths. So many myths. Stories of floods, of great cities swallowed by water, of ancestors who arrived from distant islands long lost to the sea. These tales shimmer across Mesoamerican and South American traditions. Quiet echoes, strange coincidences. Or are they? Some Atlantologists, those who see Plato's tale as more than allegory, have suggested that Atlantis might not lie in the Atlantic at all, that perhaps Plato got the direction wrong, that the sea beyond the Pillars of Heracles was not the Atlantic Ocean as we know it, but the passage to the Americas, an entire hemisphere unseen, unknown, but not necessarily untouched. Take the Hopi, a Native American people from the deserts of Arizona. Their creation stories speak of previous worlds destroyed by water. One world perished in fire, another in ice, another in flood. Survivors, guided by spirit beings called kachinas, journeyed to safety. Some myths even describe crossing great bodies of water on reed boats or in flying shields. Are these metaphors, dreams, or something older? The Maya too had flood legends. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, gods destroyed an early version of humanity with a great flood. The Aztec Codex Borgia depicts similar themes, worlds created and destroyed in cycles, each one ending in catastrophe. Historians are still debating whether these flood myths have any link to distant tales like that of Atlantis, or whether they reflect regional experiences with hurricanes, tsunamis, or rising seas. But the resemblance is hard to ignore, and then there's the Olmec. Often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the Olmec flourished around 1500 BCE, building pyramids, carving colossal stone heads, and leaving behind mysteries still unsolved. Their origins are unclear. Their written language remains undeciphered. Some researchers have pointed to similarities between Olmec iconography and other distant cultures: elephant-like motifs, strange helmets, unexpected tools. Could they have preserved a memory of something much older? Something brought across the sea? Mainstream scholars say no. There's no evidence of transatlantic contact before Columbus. No Atlantean relics in the jungles. No orichalcum. No concentric ring cities. No names in Plato's texts that resemble Nahuatl or Quechua or Mayan. The timelines don't line up. The cultural threads don't tie neatly. And yet. In 1552, a Spanish chronicler named Pedro Chiesa de Leon wrote of Andean legends that spoke of bearded white men who came from the sea and taught people how to live. These myths predated the conquest. Were they coincidences, reflections of earlier visitors, or distortions created by missionaries? Some modern theorists have gone further, pointing to the mysterious ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, high in the Andes, where stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons rest in patterns no one quite understands. They've argued that such engineering implies knowledge lost, passed down, or perhaps inherited. Again, no proof. But the questions remain. One curious detail from Plato deserves mention here. He describes Atlantis as being capable of crossing to the other continent. Most interpret this to mean Libya or Europe, but the phrase has tantalized those who see a larger world in his words. Could he have been alluding, unknowingly, to another continent? One unknown to his peers, but remembered in the hazy lore of temple priests? It's unlikely. But the Atlantic was always a boundary in the imagination, a place of unknowns, and Atlantis, by its nature, is a thing of boundaries. Here's an odd little echo for your sleepy thoughts. In the Caribbean, there's a word, atl, in the Nahuatl language. It means water. Not a connection, surely, just coincidence. But it lingers, like a wave against the shore, and there's more. In the Andes, the Inca spoke of Viracocha, a god who rose from Lake Titicaca and brought knowledge to humanity before disappearing across the ocean. He was bearded, unlike the Inca. He wore long robes. He came from, and returned to, the sea. Again, the stories twist. Are they garbled memories? Colonially influenced? Symbolic? Or are they the sediment of something deeper? Let's not leap to conclusions. There's no Atlantean calendar stone. No lost inscriptions linking Tenochtitlan to Plato. The beauty of the Americas is its own, self-made, independent. The grandeur of the Maya and the Inca need no ghost cities to explain them. But that doesn't mean the stories don't rhyme. Because what is Atlantis, if not the idea that the world is older than we think? That knowledge can be lost? That greatness can be forgotten? That water has memory? So as you lie there, drifting, picture a canoe sliding silently across the black surface of a Central American lake. Picture the stars above and stories whispered in the dark, of cities swallowed, of ancestors saved, of islands now gone. Picture a people who remember not the name Atlantis, but its shape, its loss, its sorrow. And maybe, just maybe, that's the story we're all telling. Not of a city that sank, but of a world that forgot where it came from. Atlantis isn't always beneath the waves. Sometimes it's in the myths we carry. Every myth has its evangelist, and for Atlantis that torchbearer was Ignatius Donnelly, a man of conviction, contradiction, and considerable imagination. A 19th century American congressman, novelist, and self-styled historian, Donnelly was not content to let Atlantis drift quietly through classical philosophy. He wanted it real, measurable, responsible for every miracle of ancient architecture from Egypt to Peru. And in 1882 he wrote a book that changed everything. Atlantis. The antediluvian world was Donnelly's opus, a sprawling speculative manifesto of over 500 pages. In it he argued that all great ancient civilizations could trace their roots to a lost motherland in the Atlantic. The pyramids of Egypt, Atlantean wisdom, the stepped temples of Mesoamerica, Atlantean refugees, the flood myths of Genesis and Gilgamesh, memories of Atlantis' demise, even the alphabet, metallurgy, agriculture. They were not born independently, he claimed, but inherited from a single source. It was bold, it was dramatic, and it sold astonishingly well. Readers devoured it. Donnelly's Atlantis was more than Plato's. It was the missing chapter in human history, the keystone that made all the fragments fit. And in an age of empire and discovery, when European powers were digging up ruins and deciphering hieroglyphs, people wanted grand explanations. Donnelly gave them one. But was he right? Not quite. His book was riddled with assumptions, false equivalences, and leaps of logic. He drew connections between cultures separated by oceans and millennia. He mistook coincidence for correlation. His belief in diffusionism, the idea that civilization began in one place and spread outward, was popular at the time, but has since been largely abandoned in favour of independent invention. Historians are still debating how ideas like agriculture, writing, and pyramid building developed, but most agree they emerged independently in multiple regions. Ancient Egypt did not need blueprints from a sunken island to build monuments, neither did the Maya. Human ingenuity runs deep. Still, Donnelly's impact was immense. He helped transform Atlantis from a footnote in philosophy into a cultural icon. His ideas inspired countless writers, mystics, and pseudoscientists. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, wove Atlantis into her spiritual doctrine. Edgar Cayce, decades later, would claim to access Atlantean memories in trance. Even fiction took hold. Jules Verne, H.P. Lovecraft, and eventually Disney would build their own Atlantises on Donnelly's foundations. Here's an odd and rather charming fact. Donnelly wasn't some obscure eccentric. He was a respected political figure in Minnesota. He served in Congress, championed progressive causes, and later ran as a populist vice presidential candidate. He believed in equal rights, public education, and technological progress. His interest in Atlantis wasn't rooted in escapism. It was, for him, a search for truth. But he went looking with a lantern made of fantasy. He cherry-picked myths. He leaned heavily on the idea that cultures couldn't possibly develop advanced ideas on their own. If two societies built pyramids, it had to mean they were related. That kind of thinking has since been challenged, not just because it's inaccurate, but because it robs ancient peoples of their own brilliance. And yet, you can't help but admire Donnelly's ambition. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He believed history had a secret centre, a heart, a vanished land that explained the rest, and that's a very human impulse. After all, don't we all look for meaning in the ruins? Donnelly's book begins with Plato, but it quickly spirals outward, into geology, linguistics, comparative mythology. He claimed that Atlantis sank at the end of the last ice age, around 9,000 years before Plato, a time when sea levels rose dramatically. And in this, at least, he was not wrong. The timing fits, the climate shifted, flood myths spread. It's what he built on top of those facts that draws scrutiny. Still, the book endures. You can read it today, free and online, as many do. It is verbose, flawed, outdated, and utterly compelling. Like an antique globe, beautiful in its distortions, a reminder of how stories grow when we water them with longing. Donnelly wasn't trying to deceive, he was trying to remember. He saw a broken past and tried to piece it together with words, And maybe that's why his Atlantis still echoes, because it was built not on gold, but on questions. Here's a soft thought to end on. In 1882, as Donnelly's book rolled off printing presses, archaeologists were uncovering Troy, long considered a myth, on the hills of Hisarlik. It was a triumph. Myth turned real. If Troy could be found, why not Atlantis? But Troy left ruins. Atlantis did not. Or perhaps it did. And we just don't know how to read them. So as your breath slows and your thoughts drift outward like ships in a twilight harbour, think of Ignatius Donnelly at his desk, candle burning, pen scratching, surrounded by maps and scrolls and dreams, trying to rescue a lost world, not from the sea, but from silence. And perhaps, in his own flawed way, he did. Some stories are dangerous, not because of what they say, but because of what people want them to say. Atlantis, shimmering on the horizon of imagination, has been many things: a utopia, a cautionary tale, a cradle of wisdom. But in the wrong hands, it became something else entirely: a weapon of ideology, a myth reborn as propaganda. In the 1930s, as Europe drifted into darkness, Nazi Germany became obsessed with origins. The question of where a people came from wasn't just academic, it was political. Racial purity, superiority, ancestry as justification for empire. And into this storm, Atlantis drifted like a ghostly promise. Enter the Ahnenerbe. Officially, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. Founded by Heinrich Himmler in 1935, it was a state-sponsored organization dedicated to proving the supremacy of the so-called Aryan race. Its mission? To find evidence, archaeological, linguistic, mythological, that ancient Germans were the heirs of a glorious prehistoric civilization. And where better to look than Atlantis? To the Nazi mind, Atlantis wasn't just a lost city. It was the original Aryan homeland, a place of racial perfection, advanced science, and spiritual purity. Its fall, they claimed, was not just a tragedy, but a blueprint, a superior people overwhelmed by inferiors, forced to scatter and seed civilization elsewhere. It was a perversion of Plato's story, and it was deadly. The Ahnenerbe sent expeditions across the world, Tibet, Scandinavia, North Africa, the Middle East, searching for symbols and ruins they could twist into proof. Skulls were measured, myths were reinterpreted, ancient sites were claimed as Germanic regardless of context. Scientific rigor was discarded in favor of ideology. One of the strangest episodes occurred in 1938 when a team of Nazi researchers travelled to Tibet. Officially, they were studying high-altitude physiology and collecting plant specimens. Unofficially, they were looking for traces of an Atlantean past, hidden wisdom, ancient bloodlines, echoes of the Aryan ideal. They found none. But that didn't stop the narrative. Back in Germany, books were published linking Atlantis to Hyperborea, a mythical northern land described by the Greeks as a place of endless sunlight and divine harmony. Nazi thinkers blended Atlantis with Thule, a legendary northern island mentioned by ancient explorers. To them, the Arctic itself became sacred ground, a frozen Eden buried beneath the ice. Some even claim that the survivors of Atlantis fled to Antarctica, where naturally Nazi Germany launched an expedition in 1938-39. Called Operation Schwabenland, it was publicly about establishing a whaling base. But rumours soon spread about secret bases, underground cities, Atlantean technology, and later, even flying saucers. These stories grew wild after the war, fed by conspiracy and cold silence. There is no evidence that the Nazis found anything in Antarctica. But that didn't matter. The idea had taken root. Historians are still debating the extent to which Nazi ideology shaped fringe theories about Atlantis in the post-war world. But the imprint is clear. What was once a philosophical allegory became a racial myth, a narrative twisted to justify conquest, cruelty, and genocide. And this is the dark side of Atlantis, because myths are mirrors. They show us what we already believe, and if what we believe is dangerous, the myth becomes a mask. Here's a grim but fascinating fact. Even after the fall of the Third Reich, Nazi-inspired Atlantis theories persisted. Some resurfaced in the occult movements of the 1950s. Others made their way into science fiction, blending with alien lore and secret government plots. The idea that Atlantis was a hub of advanced technology, lost, hidden, or forbidden, owes much to these origins. Even the term ancient aliens, now a staple of pop culture, has roots in these distortions. In some circles, Atlanteans weren't just advanced, they were extraterrestrial, or part god, or from a vanished race with powers beyond imagining. The goal was always the same, to place wisdom outside the reach of ordinary humanity, to make it rare, exclusive, belonging to the chosen few. It's seductive and dangerous. So what do we do with this? How do we hold a story that has inspired both wonder and horror? Perhaps we remember that Atlantis, as Plato told it, was not a paradise. It was a warning, a city that fell because it forgot its soul, a people who, in their pride, became blind. That's the heart of the story, not the gold, not the gods, but the fall. And if we forget that, if we rewrite the myth to serve our own ego, we risk repeating it. But Atlantis can be reclaimed, it can be retold, it can be a story about humility instead of supremacy, about loss instead of legend, about the fragility of greatness. Here's a quieter thought. For the hush before sleep, the Ahnenerbe failed. The ruins they sought refused to speak their language. The past does not belong to ideologies, it belongs to no one and to everyone. It is not a straight line, but a labyrinth. And Atlantis, with all its ambiguity, reminds us of that. So close your eyes, if they haven't already. Let the storm pass. Let the myth shed its shadow. You're safe. And Atlantis, whatever it was, is not in the hands of those who would twist it. It belongs to dreamers, to seekers, to you. Let's leave the myths behind for a moment. Let's set aside the golden temples, the feathered gods, the prophecies and conspiracies. Let's step quietly into the stone, into the crust of the earth. Because beneath all the stories and symbols there is a question that still stirs the minds of geologists, oceanographers, and planetary scientists. Could there be a geological basis for Atlantis? Not a perfect ringed city or a hub of ancient magic, but a landmass, a structure, a feature of the Earth's changing face that inspired the myth. Something that sank, something that was swallowed. Start with the basics. The Earth's crust is not still. It drifts atop a sea of molten rock, shifting along tectonic plates that collide, split and grind. Mountains rise, oceans open, continents creep. This dance has been going on for billions of years. The Atlantic Ocean itself is young, geologically speaking. It opened up roughly 200 million years ago, tearing apart the supercontinent Pangaea like wet parchment. And in the centre of that ocean lies a scar, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This underwater mountain range snakes from the Arctic to the southern Atlantic, a rift where tectonic plates pull apart, allowing magma to bubble up and form new seafloor. It's the site of volcanic activity, earthquakes, and slow, relentless change. Some early 20th century theorists believed Atlantis might lie here, submerged, fragmented, broken apart by the forces of geology. But modern science has revealed that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is entirely composed of oceanic crust, dense basalt, not the lighter granite of continents. Continents don't just fall into the sea, they float, so to speak, above the mantle. There's no known mechanism by which a continental landmass the size Plato described could suddenly sink. Still, the ocean floor holds secrets. There are submarine plateaus, like the Madeira Abyssal Plain, the Azores Plateau, and the Newfoundland seamounts, that rise higher than the surrounding seabed. Some of these features were once volcanic islands. Could they have once been larger? Possibly. But not large enough for an advanced Bronze Age civilization, and certainly not as large as Libya and Asia combined, as Plato wrote. Historians are still debating whether Plato's scale was literal or symbolic. His measurements are precise, but they may reflect exaggeration, or errors introduced through centuries of translation. Some geologists have entertained the idea that ancient lands did exist where there is now sea. Take Doggerland, the landmass that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. It was real, rich, and populated by Mesolithic peoples before being swallowed by rising seas around 6000 BCE. Or Sundaland in Southeast Asia, a vast peninsula that is now submerged beneath the South China Sea. These lands didn't vanish overnight, as Plato's Atlantis supposedly did, but they did vanish, slowly, almost without notice. Then there's the Canary Islands and the Azores, groups of volcanic islands rising from the depths of the Atlantic. Their abrupt cliffs and complex terrain have inspired many Atlantis theories. The Azores, in particular, sit near the triple junction of the North American, Eurasian and African tectonic plates. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and underwater landslides have all occurred there. Could a localized collapse have sunk part of an island chain? Perhaps, but no archaeological evidence has ever been recovered from these underwater regions. No structures, no tools, no walls or writing. And while sonar and submersible technologies have improved, the vast majority of the deep Atlantic remains unexplored. It's a silent abyss, but silence is not absence. Here's a curious and often overlooked geological feature: the Great Meteor Table Mount, a seamount in the central Atlantic. It's a flat-topped underwater mountain, once likely an island long ago. Over time, erosion and subsidence pulled it beneath the waves. It sits now in the dark, thousands of feet below sea level. Was it ever above water during human history? Probably not. But it stands as a reminder that Earth reshapes itself without warning, and that what rises may one day fall. Then there's the concept of isostatic rebound, the slow rise or fall of land due to the weight of ice sheets or ocean levels. During the last ice age, massive glaciers depressed the Earth's crust in places like Scandinavia and Canada. When the ice melted, the land rebounded upward. In other regions, however, rising seas flooded low-lying terrain, sometimes permanently. Could a similar process have submerged a once habitable island in the Atlantic? Geologists say it's theoretically possible, but no such landmass has been identified. Still, the Earth is full of surprises. Consider the discovery of Zealandia, an entire submerged continent near New Zealand, almost as large as India, mostly underwater. It was once part of the supercontinent Gondwana and broke apart tens of millions of years ago. No lost civilization there, of course, but a powerful reminder that massive landforms can, and do, vanish beneath the sea. So perhaps the question is not whether Atlantis existed as described, but whether Earth's deep changes have been remembered, imperfectly, through myth. Here's an odd and poetic fact. Ancient Greek sailors knew of phantom islands, land masses that appeared and disappeared on maps, sometimes reported by seafarers, sometimes proven false. Terra Incognita, High Brazil, St. Brendan's Island, places glimpsed in fog, or dreamed, or confused with others. Atlantis may have joined their ranks, a spectral reflection of a changing world. And Plato? Perhaps he heard whispers, geological echoes, stories carried from one generation to the next, shaped by memory, fear, and awe. Or perhaps he created Atlantis whole cloth as a mirror for his philosophy, a civilization undone not by tectonics, but by pride. Either way, the Earth remains the only witness, and she is not quick to speak. So now, as you settle deeper into the folds of sleep, imagine the ocean floor, dark, silent, unmoving. But beneath the crust, molten rock flows like blood. Pressure builds, ridges crack, mountains rise and fall. It's slow, patient, eternal. Atlantis may not lie beneath those waves, but something does. The memory of change, the possibility of loss, the rhythm of a planet that never stops shifting beneath our feet. By now, the story has split into many tributaries. Atlantis has been glimpsed in deserts, in jungles, under ice, and deep below the sea. But there are still more whispers to follow, more places where myth and geology brush fingers. Because the Atlantic Ocean is not just water, it's a graveyard of forgotten lands. Let's begin with the continental shelf. The Atlantic shelf is a broad, submerged edge that surrounds many continents, sloping gently before it drops into the deep ocean basins. During the last ice age, when sea levels were over 100 meters lower, vast stretches of this shelf were dry land. They would have formed coastlines, valleys, even low-lying plains, perfect for early human settlement. Could Atlantis have been one of these drowned places? Some researchers have turned their attention to areas just off the western coast of Europe and Africa. The shallow waters off Portugal, for instance, hide unusual formations, submarine canyons, plateaus, large sedimentary structures that once could have been islands or coastal plains. The Portuguese Bank, the Gorringe Ridge, and the Horseshoe Seamount are geological features that rise from the seafloor in the general region Plato pointed to. They are remote, often unexplored in detail, and geologically active. Submerged landslides and seismic activity are not uncommon here. There's also the Canary Islands, volcanic, windswept, and ancient. Some Atlantologists propose that the Canary Archipelago, along with the nearby Madeira Islands, might be the eroded peaks of a once larger landmass, perhaps the final remnants of an Atlantean plateau. Their geology is complex, shaped by magma and time, and while there's no evidence of a lost civilization, the allure remains. And then, to the north, lies Doggerland. Not in the Atlantic proper, but in the North Sea between Britain and the Netherlands, Doggerland was a Mesolithic wonderland. Lush, temperate, crisscrossed by rivers and forests. It was home to animals, humans, and possibly even early communities before it was slowly drowned by rising seas between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. We found tools there, bones, campsites, a world once full of life, now beneath the waves. Doggerland isn't Atlantis, but it shows that entire regions can disappear, quietly, without myth, without warning. Then there's the Celtic Shelf. Off the coast of Ireland and Scotland, this broad expanse of shallow sea may once have connected scattered islands and headlands. During the Ice Age, much of this land was exposed. It would have offered hunting grounds, seasonal camps, and perhaps even more permanent habitation. Here's a little-known curiosity. The ancient Irish legend of High Brazil, a phantom island said to lie west of Ireland, visible only once every 7 years. Early maps from the 14th and 15th centuries actually show High Brazil, round and mist-shrouded, off the Atlantic coast. It was believed to be a place of learning, of peace, of high knowledge. Sound familiar? Some have speculated that this legend, and others like it, may preserve distant memories of real land now submerged, myths born of retreating shorelines and vanishing ground. The subconscious scream of land being lost. Then there's Spartel Island. According to some researchers, this now submerged landmass once lay near the Strait of Gibraltar, just beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Geological studies suggest that Spartel was above water around 11,000 years ago, within Plato's proposed timeline. Submerged around 9000 BCE due to rising sea levels, it may have been a small island or low-lying bank erased by time and tide. Was it large enough to host a civilization? Unlikely. But as part of a network of lost isles and coastal settlements, it adds texture to the story. Historians are still debating whether any of these regions, the Canaries, Azores, Doggerland, Spartel, can be tied meaningfully to Atlantis. None fit all the criteria. Some fit just enough to keep the dream alive, and the more we look, the more possibilities emerge. The Caribbean, with its shallow banks and hidden ruins, the submerged shelf off the Yucatan, the Amazon basin, where evidence of vast prehistoric cities is only now coming to light, obscured by jungle and time. Atlantis has no address, but the Earth keeps offering clues. Here's a quiet thought. In 2009, researchers using sonar detected what looked like grid-like patterns on the ocean floor off the coast of the Canary Islands. The media briefly exploded. Google Earth users swore they'd found Atlantis. The pattern upon closer inspection was a digital artifact, traces left by sonar data stitching, not a city grid. But for a moment we believed. And maybe that belief matters, because beneath the literal search lies a deeper one, a longing to find continuity, to connect ourselves to something ancient, something profound, the idea that we are not the first, that others came before us, that we are echoes. So as you drift now, half awake, picture the continental shelf, not as water, but as land, as it was 10,000 years ago, fields, forests, villages, and slowly, inevitably, the sea returns. A single year, then another, then 100, and the edges begin to vanish. The horizon comes closer, roads become streams, homes become islands, until at last there is nothing left but waves, and memory, and silence. Atlantis was never just one place. It was every place that was lost. Let's return to Plato, not as a geographer or historian or secret keeper of ancient wisdom, but as a philosopher, a storyteller with a sharp mind and a clear message. Because before the map chasers and treasure hunters, before the pseudoscientists and dreamers, Atlantis was a parable, a mirror, a lesson about what happens when power forgets its soul. In Critias and Timaeus, Plato doesn't write with wide-eyed wonder. He writes with warning. Atlantis, he says, was once virtuous. Its people were born of divine lineage, children of Poseidon and mortal women. They lived simply, nobly, in harmony with the land. But over time, that nobility faded. Greed crept in, vanity, the lust for domination, and when they turned away from virtue, the gods withdrew their favour. The earth rose, the sea swallowed, the city was no more. It is not a tale of punishment exactly, but of balance lost. Plato tells us that the downfall of Atlantis was not caused by nature alone, but by hubris, a Greek word that means arrogance, the kind of pride that blinds, that leads a people to believe they are beyond correction, beyond consequence. Atlantis fell, he implies, because it had to, and Athens, his ideal city, stood in contrast, brave, wise, democratic, defenders of freedom against the Atlantean threat. In his narrative, it is Athens that saves the world from the imperial machine of Atlantis. It is Athens that upholds justice. Historians are still debating whether Plato meant this story as history or allegory, but the structure is clear. Atlantis is not merely a lost land. It is a moral story dressed in myth. And like all good myths, it wears many masks. For Renaissance thinkers, Atlantis was a symbol of hidden knowledge, lost arts waiting to be rediscovered. For Enlightenment philosophers, it represented the potential for reason and science to build better worlds. For 19th century romantics, it was a lament for innocence lost. For the Nazis, as we've seen, it became twisted into a symbol of racial purity. And for us, maybe it's something more elusive. Maybe it's the idea that civilizations are fragile, that progress is not permanent, that wisdom can be forgotten. Plato's story was written during a time of upheaval, when Athens had fallen from its golden age, when war had ravaged the Greek world, when democracy itself was under threat. Atlantis was a reflection of those anxieties, a city of wonder, brought low by its own failings, and in that it feels very modern. Because every generation tells itself a version of Atlantis. In the 20th century we imagined advanced cities destroyed by nuclear war. In the 21st we worry about rising seas, climate collapse, artificial intelligence. The names change, the fears remain. We are always Atlantis, and we are always Athens, the proud builders, the doomed architects. Here's a strange, almost laughable thought. Some scholars believe Plato never finished Critias because he couldn't decide how it should end. Did Atlantis deserve a second chance? Was its fall tragic or just? Was it lost to nature or to its own reflection? Maybe he left it unfinished on purpose, so that we would have to finish it ourselves, and in that sense, Atlantis becomes something deeper than myth. It becomes a tool, a way to ask questions we are otherwise too proud to say aloud. What do we do with power? What do we forget when we succeed? What happens when we stop listening to the world around us? Atlantis may not lie beneath the waves, but it lives in every moment a society turns inward. When wealth becomes more important than wisdom, when beauty is hoarded, when justice is sold, when the gods, however you define them, walk away. Here's an off-topic but oddly fitting fact. In 2005, a group of artists in Nevada created a temporary city in the desert. They called it Black Rock City. Each year, thousands gather there for Burning Man, a festival of creation, destruction, and radical expression. At its center, they build a temple, and at the end, they burn it. A city that rises, shines, and vanishes. Atlantis in miniature. We're drawn to the cycle, the rise, the fall, the memory. Perhaps Atlantis is less a place and more a rhythm, the breath of civilization itself. And maybe that's why it endures. Because we know how the story goes, and yet we tell it anyway. So, tonight, think of the city not as stone, but as story. Rings not of canals, but of meaning. Walls not of gold, but of questions. Atlantis is the civilization we hope we are, and fear we've already become. And if we listen closely, we may still hear the voice of Plato, gentle and warning, speaking across the centuries. Don't build too high. Don't forget your roots. Don't let the glitter blind you. The sea is patient, and stories, like tides, return. You're almost there now. At the end of this quiet road through sand and salt, myth and magma, Atlantis, once a fever dream of marble towers and glimmering domes, now lies still in your mind, less a city, more a silence, the kind that follows questions no one can answer, Or perhaps no one needs to answer, because maybe, just maybe, Atlantis was never meant to be found. Let's look at the world not with a flashlight, but with a candle. Gentle light, no rush, no demand to excavate truth from every shadow, just enough glow to see the outline of what matters. The earth has changed, continents drift, ice melts, oceans rise, volcanoes erupt and silence the sky. Islands are born and islands die. Whole worlds have been lost. Doggerland, Beringia, the sunken valleys of the Sunda Shelf. None were Atlantis, but all were real. And if there is one thing we've learned on this long, slow descent into the ocean of memory, it's that loss is natural, that forgetting is part of becoming, that what sinks does not disappear. It becomes part of the next story. There are still places to look, of course. Unmapped trenches, coral-covered ridges, ancient manuscripts in forgotten libraries. But perhaps the truest place to find Atlantis is in the act of wondering, the gesture of leaning forward into the past, the dream of connection. Because that's what we've been doing, all along. Trying to bridge ourselves to something older, something deeper than concrete or dates or sonar scans, a world before the world. Historians are still debating, still compiling, still listening, and so they should. But sometimes it's enough to not know, to rest in the unproven, to trust the rhythm of myth as it rocks us to sleep. Here's one last quiet curiosity. The word Atlantis may come from Atlas, the titan who holds up the sky. Not the earth, as many assume, but the sky. So perhaps what was lost was not a city, but a view, a perspective, a higher place from which to see ourselves. And maybe that's why we search for it, not in rocks or ruins, but in silence, in reflection, in the spaces between waves. You've heard so many stories now, of sunken lands and shattered maps, philosophers and frauds, emperors and oceanographers. You've walked from Athens to Antarctica, sailed with Donnelly, shivered on the mid-Atlantic ridge, climbed the Andes and stood on the trembling rim of myth. You've done enough for tonight. So now, close your eyes. Picture the earth as it spins. Oceans swirl, continents drift in their long sleep, tectonic dreams unfolding beneath the crust. There is no hurry, no final discovery, just the hush, the slow turning of stone and story, and somewhere, far below, the city that never was continues to not be. Still, drowned, perfect, waiting, not to be found but to be understood, to remind us what matters, not gold, not glory, but humility, balance, memory, and the long, gentle breath of the sea. You've followed this story all the way down, through quiet chambers of earth and time, through fog and fable, to where the ground slips gently beneath the waves. And now you're floating, drifting above it all. The myths have settled. The questions no longer need answers. Let them dissolve, like sand through fingers. You don't need to know where Atlantis is, only that people once dreamed of it, that they needed to dream, needed something shining and tragic, something noble and broken to explain why civilizations rise and fall, to soften the sharp edge of history. The sea is generous that way. It swallows without anger, and it returns what it takes, not in stone, but in song. A song you've been hearing in the background of your thoughts all night, the one that hummed beneath Plato's prose, that rose behind Donnelly's ink, that shivered in the fault lines and echoed through submerged hills, a song of forgetting, a song of remembering. So breathe, let the tide take you, let the past become a soft blur on the horizon. There is no need to decide whether Atlantis was real. You are real, your questions are real, and your rest, at last, is real. Let the continents sleep. Let the waves cover everything that must be left behind. And if tomorrow you feel a whisper in your chest or see an island in the mist of thought, don't be afraid. That's just Atlantis, passing by. One more time, good night.